All right. It says go. So I think that means we're live.
You're live. We're live.
Yeah. Awesome. So welcome everybody to the Cover Your Assets podcast. So really, I think, we're starting this, I think, with a main goal and mission of educating business owners and executive teams on security. I think, we're probably going to talk about a lot of other things, specifically as it relates to technology and how you can leverage technology and security to more efficiently and profitably run your business. So I have Shawn with me. Shawn is K3's Chief Information Security Officer. His primary objective is to ensure that we're delivering services in a secure way and in a way that's secure by design. So I think really been working really close with Shawn on just kind of what our overall service stack is, what we can do to better deliver services in a secure way. And he's helping us build out our information security program and specifically looking at how we might be able to walk that to specific compliance frameworks later on down the road. He has over 20 years of information security, infrastructure, and cloud and app development, private, public sector. Really just kind of been all over the place, right, Shawn?
Definitely. Yep.
So today, I think we want to talk about security versus compliance. I feel like there's a pretty big misconception, especially when we talk to a lot of industries that do have compliance regulations to meet. I think there's a misconception that just because they might be following those compliance standards, that their company is secure. So I really kind of want to dig into that with Shawn today, and probably start off just by talking about, if we had to define compliance, if we had to define security, what are the goals of each of those? I think that's kind of a good place to start and kind of dig into a little bit. So with that, Shawn, how would you define compliance, and what is the goal of compliance?
Well, first, even before getting into that, I want to go back to what you said about if a company is following those compliance guidelines, they think they're secure. That's a very big assumption because there's a really good chance, from my experience, especially dealing with businesses and regulated industries on the smaller scale, even up into what I would consider kind of butting up against the mid-sized business scale, they're not. They're not compliant at all. So let alone secure, they're not compliant. So kind of to that point, the way I would describe compliance is a set of objective criteria that defines a minimum standard for an organization to be considered adhering to at least some measure of best practices from a cybersecurity standpoint. So what does that mean? Well, a compliance standard can originate from multiple sources. It could be a national standard. It could be a privacy law. It could be an industry specific standard. Like, for example, PCI is actually not, it's not any type of a national compliance standard. It's industry specific for the cardholder industry. HIPAA is driven federally, but it's industry specific to any entity, any business that handles patient health information. Another place you may have a compliance standard or requirement that a lot of companies really don't pay attention to, or they may kind of gloss through it and then sign on the dotted line and then be liable or expected to adhere to it, is third-party requirements, contractual requirements, right? You do business with a company, you pick them up as a customer, you really want the contract, we're going to sign on the dotted line. So really what compliance is it's based on security best practices, but really it's a minimalist view, right? In order to be in the healthcare industry, you are minimally expected, in fact, you're obliged to adhere to these HIPAA security rule standards. And that's the expectation. So look at compliance as sort of a minimal set. And so, the mistake is made when people think, okay, I'm compliant, therefore I'm secure. And that is absolutely categorically false, right? Compliant means you are, according to whoever did the audit and according to the current version of the standard or the rule, you are adhering to these minimum criteria. That's all that it means. It doesn't mean that your security program, if you even have one, but it doesn't mean that any of those controls necessarily have actually been tested, vetted, or that they could withstand any kind of measured or even a simple cyber attack, right? Doesn't mean that you're invulnerable. So on the one hand, compliance does not equal secure. And I know this is getting into one of the questions later. Secure doesn't mean invulnerable, right? Secure doesn't mean you can't be penetrated, you can't be breached, you can't be hacked, you're not going to have security incidents. It doesn't mean that at all. So compliance, on the one hand, really means, it's kind of, I guess the simplest way to look at it, it's the minimum standard for kind of defining what I call a negligence benchmark, right? If you're in an industry or you're subject to contractual requirements and you're not even meeting those, that's negligence, right? As opposed to, okay, we've met the minimum requirements, right? So that's something that we have to do because we're obliged. That shows at least a minimum standard of care, right? And I mean, that's just good business that, okay, we're required to be compliant with these regulations, with these security requirements, contractual requirements, whatever they are. Now we've shown a minimum standard of care. So from there, what's security? Well, security, okay, is a holistic approach really aimed, if I had to try to define it, there's a lot of ways to define it, right? But if I had to really kind of distill it down into what I would consider a good definition, it is exercising an appropriate level of care to provide reasonable assurance that the business is able to carry out its mission, right? And that's kind of a loaded statement because an appropriate level of care, okay, presumes that it's taking into consideration the situation of the business. What's the situation of the business? Well, number one, it's the industry you're in. There's a big difference between a coffee shop and a healthcare organization, right? A clinic or a hospital or a financial services organization or a government contractor or a construction firm. Those are all unique situations. Depending on the industry, depending on the country, state, or other locale, right, you may or may not have any compliance requirements at all, right? So then what do you have? Well, you have the risk tolerance of the organization, right? You have the organization's mission, and then you have the risk tolerance of the business leadership, right? So then security becomes well, of course, there should be some minimum standard or some minimum level of hygiene that we have to adhere to, right? Even though it's not being enforced upon us, because we don't want to go out of business. We don't want to get sued, right? We don't want all these other, potentially adverse things to happen to us, right? That are risks to the business, right? And so that kind of gets into the whole domain of, well, your security program should be based on what? Well, largely it should be driven by risk, right? So if you think of good security, right, and you operate under that definition of an appropriate level of care to provide reasonable assurance. What's reasonable assurance? It means it's not foolproof. It means that you can have the best security program in the world. You can have the best security team in the world. You can have the biggest security budget in the world. You can have all of those things. And guess what? Incidents that could become breaches, that could turn into major breaches, can still happen for a variety of reasons, right? Because business is complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's people, there's processes, there's technology. There's the fact that people are human, right? And you can have a really good network admin, a really good systems engineer who accidentally makes an error in a complex system that brings Amazon Web Services down. Guess what? That's an incident, right? That hits the availability component of security, but it's still an incident, right? So all these things happen. So a security program, first and foremost, is risk focused. It takes into consideration the risk tolerance of the organization. And quite frankly, it's kind of a whole other topic, but most organizations, they don't have a risk. They don't know what the risk tolerance is because they don't even know what the risks are. So kind of what you see in a lot of organizations where they just balk about cybersecurity or they balk about compliance or they balk about anything, it's, why do we need to do this? We don't want to do this, right? And so their default posture at that point is we accept any risk, right? We accept risks that we don't even know we have. And that's a very dangerous place to be. That opens you up to a lot of liability. So the other relationship too between security and compliance is security includes, right, your security posture, your security program. It includes all of your compliance, right? So if I'm working with an organization and I'm helping them to develop a cohesive, integrated security strategy that's operational and actually functional, what am I looking at? I'm looking at what their compliance requirements are first. Okay, what state are you in? Because different states in the United States, you may or may not be aware, but there is no federal privacy law like the European Union. There's a European Union wide. In Australia, there's an Australia wide. Different countries have different privacy laws, but not us. Here,
states are starting to do that.
Precisely. So now you have to consider, okay, do I have any security requirements from on a state level, from a breach level? Am I accepting credit cards? Do I have to worry about PCI? Am I in the healthcare industry? Do I have to worry about HIPAA? And so on and so forth. Am I doing business with the European Union? And if so, am I collecting any personally identifiable information as they define it? And if so, am I ensuring that PII does not leave the European Union and is stored on servers outside the EU, right? So all of a sudden, just at the compliance level, that minimum standard level, it starts to get pretty complex, and there's a lot you have to consider. And then when you start looking at it from more of a, let's look at your business and find out what the risks are and what your tolerance is. That's when you start getting into that more constructive discussion of, okay, we've met the minimum requirements. Now we can start building up on top of that to work within the risk tolerance of the organization, because they have someone on staff or they're taking the approach of understanding what those risks are to begin with. Is that decent?
Yeah.
I think I might have bled into the second.
Yeah, you did. It's all good though. But I think one thing that would be good to touch on a little bit. So you did touch on a little bit about security and functionality. So that's kind of like a balancing act, right? Because you want your company to be secure, but somebody we listen to a lot is Eric Cole. He talks about if you want ultimate security, you can go live with the Amish and get a horse and buggy. Matt Lee, director of security at PAX8, his big thing is if you want ultimate security, give me your phone and I can just break it for you real quick so you don't have a device to deal with anymore.
Yeah, go live in a vault.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess if you could expand on that for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, how do you kind of find that balance between having the functionality you need to run your business, but at the same time doing it in a way that what risk you're accepting and mitigating appropriately?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that gets into the second part of the definition, which is a reasonable level of assurance. So in other words, you begin by doing a risk assessment and understanding, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. And I think it'd be great for another conversation about that. But let's say, for example, you do a risk assessment and you begin looking at all the different types of risks to a particular type of business, right? Whether it's healthcare and you're talking about, the risk of, and I'll give you an example, right? The risk of, let's say you're a clinic, and let's say you obviously collect and store PHI, or you use a third-party application that collects and stores the PHI, and you take credit cards to process co-payments or payments for the services you provide, an outpatient clinic. So there you begin looking at, what are the risks of the business? Well, I could have disclosure, or I could in some way compromise the credit card information, right? That's one thing. So what are the things I need to do to protect that? PHI, same thing. One of the risks of being in the healthcare business is you could have a breach where PHI is compromised, and that opens you up to significant legal and financial liability. Same thing with the credit cards. So you begin looking at those and you say, okay, those are, and this is oversimplifying, but those are a couple risks to that type of a business. There's 4 ways you can address your risk. So you can accept the risk and be like, great, I don't care. Let them come and take the credit cards. I'll just pay the fine. And a good example of that is, like, for example, you hear JP Morgan and other banks who will rig certain markets, like the precious metals markets, and they make a ton of money doing it. And then they get fined, and they just pay the fine because the money they make rigging the market is less than the fine they have to pay. That's a very good example because they can keep doing it. If the only penalty is financial and it makes sense from a monetary standpoint to keep breaking the law and doing it because all they do is pay a fine, you're going to do that all day long. They have like a 3-to-1 risk to reward. So that's the same thing. If you were an organization, a healthcare organization that made so much money that you could afford to just keep paying every time patient health information was compromised, you just do that because it makes sense from a risk reward, right? The cost benefit. So that's one way to look at it. If there are other repercussions involved, like publicity, ruining your reputation, if in fact your business could be shut down for repeated security violations, those type of things, that's another thing that could influence your decision on how you address or treat the risks you have. So you can accept it, but there's very few things that are risks. Maybe something like, maybe one risk you would accept would be, okay, you're in a certain geographic location once every 100 years, or maybe once every, like you're doing business in Wyoming, right? You're going to accept the risk of Yellowstone erupting because it's probably not going to happen in your lifetime, right? So that's one you might accept. But you look at it in terms of what's the probability of this happening, what's the actual impact, right? If you can boil it down to a financial level, great. But what's the overall impact versus the likelihood of this thing happening? And that determines, okay, am I going to just accept it outright, do nothing? Or do we move on to the next option, which is mitigate? So mitigate means, okay, I know that storing or transmitting or accepting credit card information, collecting, creating, updating, and storing patient information, those are risks to my business because those things could be disclosed, they could be exfiltrated, it can be bad for my business. So there you say, great, I have to mitigate it because I'm not going to avoid the risk, right? So, you could avoid it and say, well, I don't even want that headache. I'm not going to be in the healthcare business. But really, you're going to mitigate it. Okay, what are the things that I can now do to reasonably ensure that this information is accessed by the people who need it, when they need it, where they need it? In that it's not able to be tampered with, it's not able to be disclosed or exfiltrated and things like that. And that's where you come into a real discussion of what's appropriate for the business, right? And then from there, it kind of ties in with the risk tolerance level. Okay, now we've met the minimum criteria, we're good with HIPAA, great, we're doing all that. Now, are we comfortable with the risk tolerance of the overall organization, the executive leadership, and so on? And then finally, of course, there's risk transference. That's where you get into things like insurance, right? And here's the thing, right? We're talking about insurance now a lot in the industry. Everybody's talking about how it's becoming more and more difficult to get cyber liability insurance. Their requirements are becoming more stringent. And the reason is because you can't just say, I have a risk, I'm going to transfer it over here and just pay money to do so. They know that that's not a viable option. So now what they're doing is they're coming back to the policyholder and saying, okay, policyholder, we will underwrite a policy for you if you mitigate your risk to a level we are comfortable with. And so my advice to businesses of all stripes is follow the lead of the insurance companies. They're a lot smarter than you when it comes to risk management because that's what they do for a living. So if they are requiring you to mitigate certain risks down to a level that they're comfortable accepting, maybe you should start having a mentality about risk that you're looking to mitigate your risk to a level you're comfortable having. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, it sounds like a good first step, and maybe this would kind of bleed into, I think, where we can kind of end off with this is, if a business owner or an executive level leadership team is listening in on this, if they really don't have any security strategy right now, what's a good starting point? And kind of what I'm just thinking I heard from you just now is, maybe risk assessment might be a good starting point because at the end of the day, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't have those risks kind of written out in a qualitative and quantitative way, you don't really know if you're willing to accept it or if it's worth mitigating it. Is that kind of what you would expand on as a starting point?
Always. Yeah. The best starting point for anyone right? Especially if you don't have, forget a formal, but if you're completely lost, it's really beginning with a quality risk assessment. And you can even start out, it doesn't have to be this expansive, expensive thing where you go out to one of the, big five firms and get them to come in and do this, $50,000 risk assessment. You can really start very informally just by beginning to look at, okay, what industry am I in? What compliance requirements am I subject to as a result of that? And is there PCI? Is there GLBA? Is there HIPAA? Who are my customers? And do they have cybersecurity requirements in their contracts? Beginning to kind of inventory that. And then from there, beginning to really get a handle on your own situation. Okay, in order for me to do my business, what does it rely on? What software, services, infrastructure, whatever the case is, service providers, what am I using that if those things suddenly stopped working or were unavailable, would render my business unable to even function, right? You can go a long way just by starting with that low-hanging fruit of looking at it that way, right? So in other words, there's something called the business impact analysis, right? That's where you go in, you start looking at all your major business functions, all the critical systems and moving parts that comprise those, the personnel, you really get detailed. So even for an organization that doesn't want to engage at that level yet, they can start to do a little bit of that internally. So at least they start to have a growing level of awareness, right? So yeah, they may not have the same ability as a risk practitioner or a security practitioner to really get them to where they want to go as far as the security program. But now they're at a level of awareness where, okay, we're starting to realize what we don't know, and that we have all of these vulnerabilities and all of these risks and all of these things that we're really not comfortable with. The worst place to be is when you just have that, ignorance is bliss attitude, and I just want to kick the can down the road and it'll all just go away. And I was just having this conversation with a gentleman who runs a healthcare related organization, a clinic, and they keep expanding. It's like, dude, you're opening clinics in all these different states and you're getting all these employees and you're not even compliant, not even close. I mean, I said, that's gross negligence right there. And I tell you and your partners that to your face. Right. So, and that's the thing too. And, kind of in closing, the thing about compliance is your compliance at the minimum level is only as good as your auditor, right? I mean, if the auditor comes in and they don't really care and they don't really have a background in security or technology or anything related to that, a lot of times they'll just check the box, right? Yep, good enough. Oh, that screenshot's good. Oh, you provided a screenshot along with the
It's always cracks me up with auditors. Just send me a screenshot.
Send me a screenshot because they just want to get done and move on. And that's changing. Okay. The good news for the industry is it's changing because organizations are now hiring people with real security skills, real penetration testing skills, right? People who are actually, they have a background in security as opposed to people who have a background in accounting, because the audit industry really kind of grew out of accountants, CPAs, because why? They're good auditors, but they're not good security practitioners. And so now you're getting a lot more security practitioners who are being given or developing the audit skills. So it's something that is improving, but so really kind of to sum it up, it's this whole idea of a minimalist approach. You're at least not negligent if you're compliant, right? Versus this is something that's really intrinsic to my organization. I'm taking an approach to this that not only incorporates the compliance, but also takes into consideration all of these other objectives, risks, vulnerabilities, and other objectives of the organization as something that can really drive the business forward in a way that safeguards. And that's why I use, the whole goal of security is to safeguard the organization's ability to carry out its mission. It's a safeguard. And quite frankly, today, with the dependence we have on technology, if you're not taking this stuff seriously, it's just a matter of time before you suffer a very serious, whether it's a data breach or denial of service attack or some other incident that impedes perhaps permanently, your ability to do business. So
Yeah, and I really like what you're saying about, at the very least, start an informal process of trying to figure out what your risks are and just kind of go through that. And I feel like that might be maybe a good topic to go through another day, is maybe go through what that informal process might look like
exactly.
for a business owner to be able to kind of at least kind of inventory what those risks might be.
Mhm.
And at least have some kind of formula to go by to say, this is how much it can cost me if I don't fix it. Then
Mhm.
I think that at least gives somebody a starting point to say, you know what, I really need to get some professionals engaged on this, or get some kind of consultant in to kind of tell me where I need to go with this.
Yeah,
Uh,
it'll be on the it'll at least be on their radar, right?
yeah,
That's the goal. Is right now the problem is I see so many companies, it's not even on their radar. If they knew half of what I know about what their risks are, they wouldn't be able to sleep at night, and yet they carry on as if, I don't even want to deal with this, I don't want to spend any money, what's the cheapest we can do this, do I really need to
yeah.
do this?
And when you get into the cost, I think, thinking about a company that might have 100 employees right now, if they know they're going to grow to 300, 400 in the next couple of years, it's probably going to cost them a whole lot more to start taking action on that when they have 300 employees versus if they start looking at that right now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And a real simple example. I mean, I was working with a company a few years ago, and they did business with a lot of big names. So, of course, the big names publicly traded SOX compliance, right? And they were technology companies. Therefore, clearly, information security was a big deal to them. So, in the document in the contract, there was a relatively standard list of what I would consider, third party security requirements. And that's becoming a real big thing now, is supply chain risk. That's another whole podcast. But and this is something that a lot of companies don't realize they need to have, either by contract, by insurance contract, or by compliance to begin with, right? Is a formally defined, not just a program, a security program that's written, but a formally defined and assigned set of security roles in security leadership, which implies it has to be somebody that's qualified, right? How many of these companies are signing off on things or are subject to compliance and they don't have security leadership? And that doesn't mean Sally, the receptionist. Hey, Sally, guess what? New job role. You're our security officer. Congratulations. That doesn't fly, right? If somebody came in, if your client came in and said, okay, let me meet your security officer. Oh, here's Sally. She's out picking up some donuts right now.
Yeah, she
So
answers the phones too, and
she answers the phones, right? Does the dry cleaning and gets the donuts and keeps the coffee stocked,
yeah,
right? That doesn't work. And so that's an example right there of, well, how do I even get security leadership? That's where, you engage with a company that can do virtual CISO services or other types of consulting, where even if your formal security leader in the organization, maybe it's the COO, right? Maybe it's the CEO, because they're the internal and they're going to accept responsibility. But then they say, I'm not qualified, so I'm going to engage with an advisor who can help me so that I can actually at least fulfill the role, in a capacity that's appropriate with the contract and due diligence and due care, both for the organization and for the work I'm doing for this customer. So that's another option where you can get that. So
yeah, and I think the fractional route can really be helpful because a lot of those companies that we're talking about, like we said, if we're only talking about 100, 300 employees, chances are that CEO has a lot of other things going on their roadmap, or
right.
COO in my case. That's one of the reasons we brought you in. The thought kind of crossed our minds for me to kind of wear that security officer hat, and it's like, what about the other 10 hours of work that I have to do every day? So yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And you want somebody too who has more experience, and that's what they specialize in.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's accessible to organizations at a rate that's a lot more attractive. They don't have to hire someone, but they do need to staff it with someone who is qualified, at least at an advisory level.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Awesome, man. Well, it looks like we're right at
right
what
at
time?
30 minutes. I did it.
30 minutes. So
I did it.
I think we have about 15 topics I heard in your spills that we can kind of dig into more next time. But
Yep. 15 topics. We've got guests we want to bring on, panel discussions. I'm going to see if I can get on Matt Lee's podcast. You bet.
Yeah. A lot of
Not
exciting.
a beard if I have to. I'll just put on the fake beard.
Yeah, we can get you a fake beard so you can fit it.
There you
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time, Shawn. I'm looking forward to doing more of these with you and with the guests we have lined up. And for everybody else out there that might be listening, we'll see you soon.
All right. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.